Let's get into the piece that I want to discuss today. So I want to start today's post off with a question. When was the last time you had a discussion or debate with someone whose position you couldn't see, vehemently disagreed with, or actually agreed with, but you couldn't admit it? I've always had to consider this. I remember maybe about 15 years ago or so, I was having this online debate with a person who I believe to be a Latino, who, if I'm not mistaken, was studying Latin American studies as well as anthropology in a well-known American university. The debate was a common one. He, like many others I had previously debated, argued that you cannot apply American understandings of race to countries such as Brazil, and you could argue other countries in Latin America, because it simply wouldn't work. There's a different historical context. There's a different the way the neighborhoods are constructed. There's differences in the ways that each country dealt with the situation with race. So I can look at a comparative analysis between Brazil and the United States. And I remember reading a paper some years ago, like, why don't people study more race in Brazil versus Cuba, or Cuba versus Colombia, or Colombia versus Venezuela? Because the Latin American countries seem to have a whole lot more in common in terms of how they dealt with race, whereas how it seemed to play out in the United States was drastically different from all of those countries in Latin America. This is not to say one country is better than another in how they deal with this issue. I mean, it's like whether you're talking about the United States or countries in Latin America, countries like Brazil and Dominican Republic, this is not to say that one racism is particularly better. I mean, how can you say a particular type of racism is better? It's just that they're not exactly the same. They have these similarities, and then they kind of separate and go in different directions. So if you go to Brazil with an American perspective on race and racism, there's certain facets of the Brazilian situation is going to actually fool you. And it's something that I had to acknowledge some years later, but let me keep going on here. So the reason why this guy said that bringing Americanisms into the discussion on race in Brazil, he said it wouldn't work. For one thing, he said in his view, and this is something that I've always knew, the US population had long been segregated and not as racially mixed as Brazil. As such, studying the racial situation in Brazil is quite different than doing the same in the United States. At the time, my position didn't change. In fact, in my view, applying American one-dropism wasn't my position at all. The fact was, even if the infamous one-drop rule had never existed in the United States, in Brazil, one would still find a strong dividing line along lines of color that separated pretos and pardos, meaning black and brown on one side, with brancos, meaning white people, being on the other side. Afro-Brazilian activists had long argued that all pretos and pardos, meaning blacks and browns, in Brazil should be considered one group that represented the country's black population. In essence, what I'm saying here is that elites in Brazil have always deflected the idea of Brazil being a racist country, a racist society, by pointing the finger at the big bad United States. No, you guys are the ones who separated the races. You guys banned interracial marriage. So how can you point to us and say that we're racist when we have one of the biggest mixed race populations on the planet? Well, the key here is that, as I've said before, in both situations, there was an anti-Black agenda, whether in the North or in the United States situation, elite whites wanted to keep blacks and whites separated to keep so-called purity of white blood, versus in Brazil, they wanted to get rid of Black people by encouraging mixed race marriages and reproduction generation after generation, which would actually lead to the Black population eventually just completely disappearing. Both racist accounts may be different ways of achieving a goal, but both of them are very anti-Black. So the person that I was having this debate with online at that time, he was specifically speaking on this group that's called Pardos. Now, Afro-Brazilian activists say Pardos are simply part of the Black population, whereas people who want to see Brazil as just a mixed race nation that has no separation whatsoever, they see Pardos or people of mixed race, mestizos, as being completely separate from black or white. I mean, that debate can go on and on, right? That's been one of the main reasons that I felt like I needed to explain some of this stuff on my blog. Anyway, what I'm saying is that all of the social economic statistics that compared blacks, browns, and whites overwhelmingly showed that pretos and pardos in Brazil had near identical profiles in terms of quality of life statistics, which included areas such as level of education, income, chances of being harassed by police or murder, invisibility in the media, lack of representation in politics, and many other subjects. And they were at extreme disadvantages when compared with white Brazilians. The legendary Afro-Brazilian activist Abdias do Nascimento once estimated that there were about 120 million Afro-Brazilians, which at the time would have made them somewhere between 60 to 75% of the Brazilian population. And that was sometime in the 1980s or early 90s that he was saying this. Here it is 30 years later, and statistics are showing, well, claiming that there's 120 million Black Brazilians. Abdias do Nascimento was saying that 30 years ago. So it always comes down to what do you define as Black? But even with all of these claims, I still had to consider what the other side was saying. The fact is, you cannot truly maintain your position in any given debate unless you are willing to fully explore the position of the person with whom you are debating or arguing. Here it is about 15 years after that debate, and I have had to back up at least a little on my position. That's because after living in Sao Paulo for a number of years, and also noting some contradictions in the stances of Afro-Brazilian activists, I knew I needed to reconsider where I stood. This same thing also applied when I started to analyze other topics and movements. For years, when people would ask me why I first named the blog I created, Black Women of Brazil, I would always say that I noted that it seemed that Black Brazilian women had been taking the lead in the Afro-Brazilian struggle. Of course, if those of you who don't know, I've transitioned and changed the name of this blog from Black Women of Brazil to Black Brazil Today, maybe last year or the year before. And it's been known as Black Brazil Today ever since. Afro-Brazilian women had organized events, created blogs, and organizations specifically devoted to their issues. Nothing wrong with that. But somewhere along the way, I started to notice some things that struck me as a bit problematic. I mean, why did it seem that I didn't see any organization specifically addressing issues of Afro-Brazilian men? Where were the resources? I mean, we should all know by now that no group at an advantage or disadvantage can survive without both genders in the group doing well. Then, sometime between 2018 and 2020, I remember getting off of a bus on Avenida Paulista or Paulista Avenue in Sao Paulo and seeing the title of an article by Black feminist philosopher Djamila Ribeiro, which mentions something about the toxic masculinity of Black men. I didn't get a chance to read the material, and now, about 3 years later, I haven't even been able to find a magazine that featured that article. By that time, I had become aware of the term toxic masculinity coming out of leftist and feminist circles in the United States. And as such, like with so many other terms, movement, buzzwords, and business models that have made it to Brazil after having started in the US, I shouldn't have been surprised when the term in Portuguese, masculinidade tóxica, began to catch on in Brazil. Masculinidade tóxica. Just out of curiosity, was there a toxic femininity, I wondered? What made masculinity toxic in the first place? As I started to look into the definitions of the term, I wondered if the definition actually defined me. Was my masculinity toxic in some way? If so, how? Why? After breaking down this term and then reading what the other side had to say on the topic, I began to wonder if the accusations behind these suddenly popular buzzwords were actually valid. In fact, as I began to question much of the rhetoric coming out of the left for the past several years, I had to pause and wonder if many of the claims made by the left were actually valid. For example, do women really earn less money than men simply because they are women? Now, I talked a little bit about this in a previous video where I compared two of Brazil's greatest soccer players, one a woman and one a man, Neymar versus Marta. And people, I remember this debate about 3 years ago. Why doesn't Marta make the same money as Neymar? And so then, ultimately it'd be like, well, it's because she's a woman. And well, when you take a closer look at the situation, you come to find like, nah, it really has nothing to do with her being a woman. If that was the case, you could argue that, well, why is it that Marta gets paid more than probably most soccer athletes playing in Brazil itself? So it goes a lot deeper than just to say, well, it must be sexism that she's not earning as much money as Neymar. There's something else going on there. Another question, are most men actually potential rapists? Is it true that there is a femicide going on in Brazil? Do men really seek to oppress women? Are women really the more oppressed gender? These are just a few of the questions that I could ask when we start getting into these narratives that posit that men are just the problem of the entire planet. Now, again, I have to focus on the article that I'm talking about today, but when I started looking deeper into some of the numbers, I was really finding some really shocking things that totally go against the narrative that's being presented in public. Like, for example, I remember some years ago in Brazil's media, I started seeing this word of femicide popping up, talking about the assassination and murders of Brazilian women. Now, first, I have to state my position that whether you're a male or female, obviously I'm against anybody losing their life, particularly in a violent manner. But as I've kept my eye on the situation with the numbers of murders that go down in Brazil every year, I know that the vast majority of people being killed in Brazil are actually men. There was one report that I saw, it was like, at least going back at least the last 30 years, it's been very consistent that of the victims of murder in Brazil, it's always between 90 and 93% of the victims of homicide in Brazil are male. They're masculine. So my question was, how do we come to an argument that there's a femicide going on in Brazil when 90 to 93% of the people being killed every year are actually males?